Say it again, Jungkook. Look at the camera and say exactly what you just said. Suga's voice was low, but the anger in it cut through the studio like a blade. Jungkook froze beneath the bright television lights, his fingers tightening around the microphone as Jimin stared silently at the floor beside him. The live audience had stopped breathing. Millions of viewers were watching the broadcast in real time when Jungkook finally lifted his eyes and whispered, "I should have told Jimin the truth a long time ago." Suga abruptly stood from his seat. "Truth," he snapped. "After everything he went through, you chose to say this here." Jimin's expression changed for only a second, but Suga noticed it, the faint tremble in his hands, the way he tried to smile as if nothing inside him had just broken open again. Then Jungkook made a confession nobody in the room was prepared to hear. The cameras kept rolling. The hosts didn't know whether to interrupt. And as Suga took one furious step toward Jungkook, Jimin suddenly grabbed his wrist. But what happened next would force everyone watching to ask one impossible question. Was Suga really angry because of Jungkook's confession? Or because he had known Jimin's secret all along? Tell me honestly, whose side would you take in this moment? The studio remained exactly as it had been at the end of that explosive moment. No one had moved far from their original seats. The enormous LED screens behind them continued glowing with the colors of the live program, while the red light above the main camera remained on, silently reminding everyone that the broadcast was still reaching millions of people. The audience sat frozen in their seats. A few seconds earlier, the atmosphere had been warm. There had been laughter, playful teasing, and the familiar chemistry that usually appeared whenever the members of BTS were brought together in front of cameras. But now, that warmth had disappeared. In its place was a silence so heavy that even the quiet sound of someone shifting in their chair seemed too loud. Suga was still standing. His shoulders were tense, and his eyes had not left Jungkook for even a second. Jimin remained beside him, one hand wrapped around Suga's wrist, not pulling him back forcefully, but holding him just firmly enough to remind him that they were not alone. Jungkook sat across from them, his microphone resting against his knee. His expression was not defensive. That was what made the situation even more uncomfortable. He looked like someone who had already spent too long arguing with himself before finally deciding that he could no longer remain silent. The host glanced nervously toward the production crew. Behind the cameras, staff members were exchanging uncertain looks. Someone near the control room lifted a hand, asking whether they should cut to a commercial break. The producer hesitated. Nothing like this had been planned. This was supposed to be one of the most anticipated reunion interviews of the year, a relaxed live television special celebrating BTS coming together again after months of individual schedules, recording sessions, rehearsals, and private time away from the spotlight. The program had been carefully prepared. Every segment had a schedule. Every camera angle had been discussed. Every topic had been approved. Yet there was one thing nobody had prepared for: Jungkook's confession. And there was another thing nobody understood yet. Why did Suga react as if Jungkook had just opened a wound that had never truly healed? Earlier that evening, the studio had looked completely different. The lights had felt warm instead of harsh. Music played between commercial segments, and the audience had laughed whenever Jin made one of his perfectly timed jokes. RM had spent several minutes talking about the strange feeling of being together in the same room again, after everyone had become so accustomed to moving at different speeds. J-Hope had leaned forward with his usual bright energy, occasionally glancing toward Jimin and smiling whenever Jimin tried to hide from the attention. Taehyung had been quieter than usual, watching the conversations with a thoughtful expression, while Jungkook had laughed easily at first. Suga, meanwhile, had appeared calm. He had arrived in the studio wearing dark clothes and a simple expression that suggested he would rather be in a recording studio than beneath a wall of cameras. Yet every time the host asked Jimin a question, Suga listened. Not obviously, not in a way that would attract attention, but he listened. Jimin had been sitting close enough for Suga to notice the smallest changes in his expression. He noticed when Jimin rubbed his thumb against the edge of his microphone. He noticed when his smile lasted a little too long, and he noticed something else before anyone else did. Jimin had barely touched the glass of water placed in front of him. To everyone watching, it meant nothing. It was a glass of water on a television set, but Suga had spent enough years around Jimin to know that sometimes the smallest habit said more than words ever could. The interview had begun with a simple question. The host had asked the members what they had missed most about being together. Jin answered first, making everyone laugh by saying he missed having people around who understood his jokes even when they were terrible. J-Hope said he missed the noise. RM spoke about conversations that could not be planned, the kind that happened late at night when everyone was too tired to pretend they had all the answers. Taehyung said he missed being understood without needing to explain himself. Jungkook smiled and said he missed everything. Then the host turned toward Jimin. "And you?" she asked gently. Jimin smiled. "I think I missed feeling ordinary around them." For a moment, nobody laughed. There was something unexpectedly quiet in his answer. The host tilted her head. "Ordinary?" Jimin nodded slowly. "When you're alone for a long time, people ask you who you are becoming. They ask what your next goal is. They ask whether you're happy, but with people who have known you for years." He glanced toward the other members. "Sometimes you can just sit there and not have to explain anything." The audience responded with soft applause. Suga looked at Jimin for a little longer than anyone noticed, except Jungkook. Jungkook noticed. His smile faded slightly. That was the first moment something changed. It was almost invisible, a shift in his posture, a glance that lasted too long, his fingers tightening around the microphone before relaxing again. The host moved on to other questions, and the conversation returned to lighter memories. They spoke about rehearsals, old arguments, forgotten lyrics, exhausting travel schedules, and the ridiculous things they had done when they were younger. But Jungkook gradually became quieter. At first, the others assumed he was simply tired. The schedule had been demanding, and everyone knew how exhausting a live broadcast could be. But Suga noticed that Jungkook was not tired. He was waiting for something. Or perhaps waiting for the courage to say something he had already decided to say. During the next segment, the host asked each member to share something they had never properly said to another member. It was meant to be a sentimental game, a harmless television segment. One member at a time, they would choose someone and say something honest. Jin spoke to RM about carrying responsibility without always showing how heavy it was. RM thanked him with a quiet smile. J-Hope spoke to Taehyung about trusting his own instincts. Taehyung lowered his eyes, touched by the words. Then it was Jungkook's turn. He looked down at the cards in front of him, but he did not pick one up. "I don't need a card," he said. The host smiled, unaware of what was coming. "You already know what you want to say," Jungkook nodded. "Yes." His eyes moved across the couch. They stopped on Jimin. At first, Jimin smiled, assuming another playful memory was coming. Then Jungkook didn't smile back. Jimin's expression slowly changed. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked, attempting to laugh. Jungkook took a breath. "Because I owe you an apology." The audience became quiet. Suga looked up. RM's expression changed first. It was subtle, but his eyes sharpened. He had heard something in Jungkook's voice that told him this was not part of the planned segment. Jimin leaned back slightly. "For what?" he asked. Jungkook looked toward the floor. "For something I should have said years ago." That was when the producer first reached for his headset. Behind the cameras, someone whispered, "Is this scripted?" Another person shook their head. On the couch, Suga remained perfectly still. "Jungkook," RM said carefully, his voice low enough that it sounded more like a warning than a question, but Jungkook continued. "There was a time when Jimin was going through something, and I knew." Jimin's smile disappeared completely. "Stop." The single word was quiet, almost gentle, but Jungkook looked at him anyway. "I knew you were struggling." "Jungkook," Jimin said again. This time his voice was firmer. Suga slowly turned his head toward him. "What are you talking about?" The host sat silently, her professional smile gone. She could feel that the interview had crossed into something deeply personal. Jungkook swallowed. "There was a night after rehearsal. Everyone else had gone home. Jimin stayed behind." Jimin immediately looked toward the cameras, then toward the audience. His breathing became slightly uneven. "You don't have to talk about that." "I know," Jungkook replied. "That's why I should have talked about it with you instead of pretending I didn't see it." The audience did not know what he meant. The viewers watching from home did not know either, but Suga did. The change in his face was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, something far more dangerous. His jaw tightened. His eyes hardened. Jimin felt it and immediately reached toward him as if he already understood what Suga was about to do. Jungkook continued before anyone could stop him. "That night, you were sitting alone in the practice room. You thought nobody was there." Jimin closed his eyes for a brief second. "Please." "You were crying," Jungkook said, and the studio fell completely silent. Suga stood up. The movement was so sudden that his chair slid backward against the polished floor. Jimin grabbed his wrist instantly. "Don't," Jimin whispered, but Suga was no longer looking at him. His eyes were fixed on Jungkook. "You saw him?" Jungkook nodded. "Yes." "And what did you do?" The question came slowly, too slowly. Jungkook looked at Suga, then back at Jimin. "Nothing." Suga took one step forward. "Nothing. I was young," Jungkook said, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't know what to say. So you walked away." Suga's voice rose for the first time. The audience gasped. Jimin tightened his grip. "Yoongi." But Suga did not stop. "You saw him crying alone and you walked away." Jungkook looked directly at him now. "Yes." The confession landed harder than anyone expected. RM rose slightly from his seat, ready to intervene. Jin's expression had lost all trace of humor. J-Hope looked between Jungkook and Jimin, his face filled with concern, while Taehyung stared at the floor as if he were remembering something nobody else had said. Then Jungkook added the words that changed everything. "And that wasn't the only time." Suga froze. Jimin's hand slipped from his wrist. For the first time since the conversation began, Jimin looked genuinely afraid, not of Suga's anger, not of the cameras, but of what Jungkook might reveal next. The red camera light continued glowing. The broadcast was still live. Somewhere behind the main stage, a producer finally gave the order to prepare a commercial break. But before anyone could interrupt, Suga leaned forward and spoke in a voice so quiet the entire studio had to listen carefully to hear it. "What else did you know?" Jungkook stared at him. His eyes were full of regret. "More than I ever admitted." And in that moment, Jimin suddenly whispered something neither the audience nor the cameras were prepared to hear. "Because you told me not to tell anyone." Suga's face changed. Jungkook's confession was no longer the only secret in the room. The question now was far more complicated. If Jimin had known all along that Jungkook was carrying this guilt, why had he chosen to protect him? And what exactly had happened on that forgotten night that Suga seemed determined to keep buried? For several seconds after Jimin said, "Because you told me not to tell anyone," nobody in the studio seemed to know how to breathe. The sentence was not loud. Jimin had almost whispered it, yet it carried more weight than Suga's anger, Jungkook's confession, or the stunned silence of the live audience. Jungkook lowered his head immediately. His fingers curled tightly around the microphone, and for the first time that night, he looked less like someone trying to reveal a secret and more like someone who had finally run out of places to hide from it. Suga stood motionless in front of him. The anger was still there, but something else had entered his expression now, confusion. Behind the cameras, the producer was counting down toward a commercial break, but the host quietly raised her hand. She understood that interrupting them now would only make the moment feel more unnatural. This was no longer a television segment. It had become something painfully human unfolding under lights that were far too bright. Jimin slowly released Suga's wrist and looked at Jungkook. "You promised me," he said. Jungkook nodded. "I know. You promised you would never talk about it." "I know. Then why are you doing this now?" Jungkook looked toward the audience, then at the cameras that were broadcasting his face to millions of people. "Because I realized keeping a promise isn't always the same as doing the right thing." Suga let out a short, humorless breath. "That's convenient to realize on live television." RM immediately stood. "Yoongi." "No," Suga said without looking at him. "Let him answer." Jungkook accepted the words without protest. "You're right, I shouldn't have said it here." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "I shouldn't have chosen this place, I shouldn't have surprised him, but every time I tried to say something privately, I stopped. And every time I stopped, I convinced myself that silence was protecting him." Jimin looked away. His eyes were fixed on the glowing floor beneath the chairs. "It was protecting me," he said quietly. "Or at least I thought it was." That answer changed Suga's expression again. He finally turned toward Jimin. "You thought." Jimin did not answer. The studio went silent once more. Somewhere near the side of the stage, a staff member carefully placed a bottle of water on a small table. Nobody reached for it. The air conditioning continued humming above them, almost absurdly ordinary against the tension building between the people on stage. Jungkook looked at Jimin. "You didn't want anyone to know because you thought they would worry." Jimin gave a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "People were already worried about enough things." "That's not an answer," Suga said. Jimin looked at him. "It's the only one I had." There was no anger in Jimin's voice, but there was exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of that evening, something older, something that had clearly survived long after the night Jungkook was describing. Suga noticed it. So did RM. The two of them exchanged a brief glance, the kind that comes from years of knowing when a person is saying less than they are feeling. Jungkook finally spoke again. That night wasn't just about crying in the practice room. Jimin closed his eyes. Jungkook, I'm not going to say everything. Then don't say anything. Jungkook looked hurt by that. That's exactly what I've been doing for years. Before Jimin could respond, Suga stepped between them slightly. His anger was no longer directed only at Jungkook. It was spreading into the room, searching for the truth nobody had wanted to name. What happened that night? He asked. Jungkook remained silent. Suga's eyes narrowed. You came to me after that. Jungkook looked up sharply. Jimin did the same. What? Jimin asked. Suga ignored him. His attention remained on Jungkook. You came to the studio the next day. Jungkook's face changed. Hyung, you stood outside the door for almost 10 minutes. Suga's voice was quiet now. Then you walked in and asked me if I had ever seen someone look like they wanted help but still tell you to leave them alone. Jungkook swallowed hard. I didn't say it was Jimin. You didn't have to. Suga's words cut through him. Suddenly the hidden conflict was no longer only between Jimin and Jungkook. Suga had known something was wrong. He had known enough to understand Jungkook's question, yet he had apparently remained silent too. Jimin stared at him. You knew. Suga finally looked at him. There was no easy answer in his eyes. I knew something. Jimin laughed once quietly, but there was no amusement in it. Something. Jimin. That's what everyone says when they don't want to admit they knew more. Suga's expression tightened. The audience shifted uneasily. The conflict had become more complicated than anyone expected. Jungkook had carried guilt for walking away. Suga had carried the knowledge that something was wrong, and Jimin had spent years believing he had successfully hidden everything from both of them. RM slowly sat back down, his hands clasped together. He knew better than anyone that there were moments when stepping between people could prevent a fight, but there were other moments when silence was the only space where honesty could finally survive. Jimin stared at Suga. What did you know? Suga did not answer immediately. His eyes dropped to the floor. Not enough. That's not what I asked. I knew you were staying later than usual. Suga began. I knew you were practicing alone even when there was no rehearsal. I knew you kept saying you were fine when you clearly weren't sleeping properly. Jimin's face became still. And you did nothing. Jungkook looked toward Suga, shocked by the question. It was the same accusation Suga had thrown at him moments earlier. The words now returned to him from a different direction. Suga looked directly at Jimin. I asked you. Once. More than once. Not in a way that made it possible to answer. That hit harder than shouting would have. Suga's shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time that evening, he looked genuinely vulnerable. Then I failed you too. The audience gasped softly. Jimin immediately looked away. His expression softened, but only for a moment. He was not ready to forgive anyone. Not yet. Because the real conflict had never been about one person walking away or another person failing to ask the right question. The deeper wound was much harder to see. Jimin had become so accustomed to being watched that he had learned how to disappear in plain sight. He could smile in photographs, dance under enormous lights, joke with his members, answer interviews, wave to crowds, and then return to an empty practice room carrying thoughts he did not know how to explain. He had never wanted to become a burden. He had never wanted one of the people he loved to look at him differently because they had seen him at his weakest. And somewhere along the way, hiding had begun to feel safer than being understood. Jungkook leaned forward. Can I tell them why I left? Jimin's eyes immediately moved toward him. No, Jungkook nodded slowly. Okay. He placed the microphone down. The movement seemed to surprise everyone. Then I won't tell them. Suga watched him carefully. Jungkook stood up, but instead of walking toward Jimin, he took a step backward. I came here tonight thinking I needed to confess because I thought saying the truth would make things better. He looked at Jimin. But I did the same thing again. I made a decision about you without asking what you wanted. Jimin said nothing. Jungkook continued. I'm sorry. This time there was no dramatic explanation behind it. No defense. No attempt to make his guilt sound noble. Just two words spoken by someone who finally understood that regret did not automatically give him the right to reopen another person's wound. The studio remained quiet. Then unexpectedly, Jimin looked at him and asked, Why tonight? Jungkook froze. Why did you really decide to say it tonight? His expression changed. The answer was clearly more complicated than he had admitted. He looked toward the cameras and then back to Jimin. Because someone contacted me. Suga's head lifted immediately. RM frowned. Who? Jungkook hesitated. A woman. The host looked confused. A woman, Jungkook nodded. She was there that night. Jimin went completely still. Suga's expression hardened again. Who was there? Jungkook looked toward the side of the studio, beyond the cameras, toward the area where staff and guests had been standing since the beginning of the program. His face suddenly lost color. Jimin followed his eyes. So did Suga. And then everyone on stage noticed something unusual. Near the dark edge of the production area stood a woman in a simple gray coat, holding a small object tightly against her chest. She had not been part of the interview. She had not spoken to anyone, yet the moment Jungkook saw her, his breathing changed. Jimin stared at the object in her hands, a worn black notebook. His face became pale. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. The woman lowered her eyes. She looked terrified to be noticed, as if she had hoped to remain invisible even after coming all this way. A security guard stepped toward her, assuming she had entered an area where she was not supposed to stand. But Jimin suddenly rose from his seat. "Wait." Everyone turned toward him. His voice was trembling now. "Don't touch her." The woman looked at Jimin, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. Suga stepped closer to Jimin, instinctively positioning himself beside him. Jungkook stared at the notebook. "That's why you called me," he whispered. The woman nodded. "I didn't know what else to do." Jimin slowly took a step forward. The lights reflected in his eyes, but he looked as if he were no longer seeing the studio. He was seeing another place. Another night, another version of himself he had tried to leave behind. "I lost that notebook," he said. The woman held it tighter. "No," she whispered. "You gave it away." And suddenly, the forgotten night that had caused Jungkook's guilt, Suga's anger, and Jimin's silence was no longer only about the three men sitting beneath the television lights. Someone else had been there, someone none of them had expected to see again. And whatever was written inside that old black notebook had the power to reveal why Jimin had wanted everyone to remain silent for so many years. Nobody moved toward the commercial break. The countdown in the control room had already begun, but when the producer saw Jimin standing at the center of the stage, staring at the woman near the production area, he raised his hand. "Hold it," he said into his headset. "Stay with them." The red light above the camera remained on. The studio audience was still there, the same audience that only minutes earlier had expected an ordinary live reunion interview filled with laughter and old memories. Now they watched Jimin take another slow step toward a woman none of them recognized. The distance between them was less than 20 feet, but Jimin moved as if crossing into a place he had spent years trying to forget. Suga followed immediately. He did not touch Jimin, but he remained close enough that his shoulder almost aligned with Jimin's. It was a quiet gesture, instinctive and protective. Jungkook stayed near his chair, his eyes fixed on the old black notebook in the woman's hands. RM was the first to speak. "Jimin," he said carefully, "do you know her?" Jimin did not answer. His eyes were locked on the notebook. The woman looked down at it, then back at him. Her hands were shaking. "You probably don't remember my name," she said. Her voice was soft, almost lost beneath the distant hum of the studio equipment. Jimin swallowed. "Try me." The woman hesitated. "Mincio." Jimin's expression changed. It was almost imperceptible at first. Then his eyes widened. Jungkook slowly closed his eyes. Suga looked between them. "Who is Mincio?" Jimin remained silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "She was there." The audience became even quieter. Suga's face hardened. "That night," Jimin nodded once. Mincio lowered her gaze. "Not at first." Jungkook looked at her. "You told me you found him alone." "I did." She tightened her grip around the notebook. "But I didn't find him the way you think." Jimin finally stopped walking. His hands hung at his sides. For someone who had spent years performing in front of enormous crowds, he suddenly looked uncomfortable being watched by even one person. The host remained seated, unsure whether she should ask questions. She had hosted countless emotional interviews, but this felt different. These were not memories arranged for television. They were fragments of something unfinished, falling into the room without anyone knowing how to put them back together. Suga looked at Mincio. "Start from the beginning." Jimin immediately turned toward him. "No." Suga met his eyes. "Then you tell us." "Not here." "Jimin." "I said not here." The sharpness in Jimin's voice surprised everyone. Suga did not react with anger. Instead, his expression softened. "Okay." That single word seemed to change the atmosphere. Jimin looked at him, almost surprised. Suga glanced toward the producer and then toward the cameras. "Cut the broadcast." The host's eyes widened. Behind the cameras, the production crew froze. This was a live program. Cutting the broadcast would mean ending one of the biggest television events of the season without explanation. The producer spoke rapidly through his headset, but Suga did not look away. "Cut it," he repeated. Jimin stared at him. "Yoongi, you don't have to do that." "I know," Suga's voice remained calm. "I'm doing it anyway." For the first time that night, something in Jimin's expression broke, not dramatically. There were no tears yet, but the tension around his eyes softened, and he looked away quickly as if he did not want anyone to see how much those words meant to him. The screen behind the stage faded into a simple program graphic. The host thanked the audience with a voice that was slightly unsteady. Within seconds, the broadcast was replaced by an unscheduled announcement. The cameras stopped recording for television, though several behind-the-scenes cameras remained where they were until the producer quietly instructed the crew to lower them. The studio lights dimmed slightly. The audience was asked to remain seated while staff members began moving around the stage. The change was immediate. Without the red lights, the room felt smaller, more private, more human, yet the pressure did not disappear. In some ways, it became worse. Jimin walked toward a chair near the edge of the stage and sat down. He leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees. The black notebook was still in Minseo's hands. Suga stood a few feet away, watching Jimin rather than the notebook. Jungkook remained silent. The other members slowly gathered around them, not forming a circle of interrogation, but creating a kind of shelter from the curious eyes of staff and crew. Jin quietly asked a manager to move unnecessary personnel away from the stage. J-Hope approached the sound crew and requested that the remaining microphones be turned off. Taehyung pulled an empty chair toward the side of Jimin without saying anything. RM walked over to Minseo. "You came here for a reason," he said gently. "But before you say anything, you should know that nobody is going to force him to talk." Minseo nodded. "I understand." "Then why did you come?" She looked at the notebook. "Because I thought he deserved to know what happened after he gave this to me." Jimin's head lifted slowly. Suga's eyes narrowed. Jungkook stepped closer. "He gave it to you," Minseo nodded. "He didn't remember because he never saw me take it." Jimin frowned. "What does that mean?" Minseo took a slow breath. "That night I was working at the building." Her eyes moved toward the floor as she searched for the right words. "Not as staff for the group. I was cleaning offices on the upper floors. My shift ended late. I had a daughter at home and she was sick. I remember checking my phone every few minutes because my mother was watching her, and I kept thinking I should leave faster." Nobody interrupted. "Then I heard music coming from one of the practice rooms." She looked at Jimin. "It wasn't loud, just the same part of a song playing again and again." Jimin's eyes dropped. Suga knew that habit. When Jimin was struggling with choreography or emotion, he sometimes repeated the same few seconds until the music became almost meaningless. Minseo continued. "I thought someone had forgotten to turn it off, but when I looked through the glass, I saw him." Jungkook's breathing changed. Jimin's fingers interlocked tightly. "He was sitting on the floor," Minseo said. "His shoes were off, his head was down, and the music kept repeating." Jimin did not look up. "I didn't know who he was at first. I knew BTS, of course, everyone did, but I had never expected to see someone like him sitting there alone." Her voice trembled. "He didn't look famous. He didn't look like someone from television. He looked tired." Suga's expression shifted slightly. He understood exactly what she meant. There were versions of Jimin the public knew and versions only a few people had ever seen. The person Minseo had seen that night belonged somewhere in between. "I was going to leave," she continued. "I didn't want to intrude, then I heard him say something." Jimin's eyes closed. "Minseo," she stopped immediately. "I'm sorry." "What did I say?" he asked after a long silence. She looked directly at him. "You said, I don't know how to be enough when I'm alone." No one spoke. Jimin opened his eyes but kept staring at the floor. Jungkook's face crumpled slightly. Suga turned away for a moment. The sentence was not a confession about one specific event. It was worse because it was something more familiar. A private thought spoken aloud when a person believed nobody could hear it. Minseo continued only after Jimin gave the faintest nod. "Then you saw me." Jimin looked up. "I did. You opened the door." A small, sad smile appeared on her face. "I thought you were going to be angry." "I wouldn't have been angry." "You were surprised." She paused. "But you smiled at me anyway." Jimin looked confused, as if the memory existed somewhere inside him but had become blurred by everything that happened afterward. "You asked me if I had finished work." Minseo's smile disappeared. "I said yes, but you could tell I was lying." Jimin's eyes slowly widened. "Your daughter." Minseo nodded. "She had a fever." Jimin leaned back in his chair. A fragment of memory had finally returned. You were crying on the phone. Yes. Your mother said she was getting worse. Mincio nodded again. And you asked me to call a taxi. Suga looked at Jimin. You remember. Jimin shook his head slightly. Not everything. Mincio looked at the notebook again. You gave me money for the hospital. Jimin immediately frowned. I didn't give you money. You put an envelope in my cleaning cart. Jimin's face softened. I did that. Yes, Mincio's voice broke. And you thought I didn't see. Jimin looked down. The memory was clearly returning in pieces now. The practice room, the music, Mincio standing in the hallway, her trembling voice on the phone, a child waiting at home. He had been drowning in his own thoughts, yet he had recognized something in her expression that he understood immediately, the fear of wanting to be somewhere else but being unable to leave. Mincio slowly opened the notebook. The pages were old, their edges bent and softened with time. I saw this after I got home, she said. I thought you had accidentally dropped it. Jimin looked at the pages. I thought I left it in the practice room. You did, she paused, but you picked it up later. Jimin stared at her. Then how did you get it? Mincio looked away. Because you came outside. The room went quiet again. You were still upset, she said. You were looking for something, I think it was this. You asked if I had seen a black notebook. Jimin nodded slowly. And I had it in my cart. Mincio's fingers tightened around the cover. I was going to give it back, but my phone rang. My mother was crying. My daughter had collapsed. Jimin's entire posture changed. Mincio. I ran, her voice cracked. I took the notebook with me by accident. For the first time, Suga's expression toward her softened. Jungkook stepped closer, listening carefully. Mincio looked at Jimin. At the hospital, while my daughter was sleeping, I finally opened it because I wanted to know whose it was. I know I shouldn't have. Jimin's face became guarded again. What did you read? Not much. Mincio's answer came quickly. The first page was open, there were only a few lines. She looked down. You had written about being afraid that people only loved the version of you that never got tired. Jimin went still, and I closed it. Mincio wiped a tear from her cheek. I closed it because I understood. Nobody moved. Her voice became quieter. My daughter had been sick for months. I worked every night and smiled every morning because she needed me to believe everything would be okay. Everyone told me I was strong. Nobody asked if I was tired of being strong. She looked directly at Jimin. Then I read your words. Jimin could not meet her eyes. I wasn't looking for a famous person in that notebook, she continued. I found someone who was scared. The hidden conflict had finally begun to reveal its true shape. Jimin had believed that his pain belonged only to him. Jungkook had believed his silence was the reason Jimin had suffered alone. Suga had believed that noticing someone's struggle was the same as understanding it. But Mincio had carried a different burden. She had spent years believing she had stolen something precious from Jimin, even though the notebook had unknowingly become part of the reason her daughter survived. The envelope Jimin had left in her cleaning cart had paid for the first emergency treatment that night. The notebook had remained in a drawer beside Mincio's bed for years afterward, not because she wanted to keep a celebrity's private possession, but because she had promised herself that one day she would return it to the person whose kindness had entered her life during one of its darkest moments. Jimin looked at her. Why didn't you come back? Mincio's eyes filled with tears again. I tried. When? Twice. She looked toward the floor. The first time I came to the building and was told you were traveling. The second time I heard about your schedule and thought maybe too much time had passed. I was ashamed. Jimin's expression softened. Ashamed. I had read your words. You read one page. It was still yours. Suga finally spoke. And now, Mincio looked at Jungkook. My daughter found out I still had it. Jungkook frowned. Your daughter, Mincio nodded. She's 15 now. A faint smile appeared through her tears. She remembers almost nothing from that night, but she knows the story. She knows someone helped her mother when nobody had to. Mincio opened the notebook to the final page. There was a photograph tucked inside. She carefully removed it. It showed a young girl sitting beside a hospital window, thin and pale but smiling at the camera. Jimin stared at the photograph. Is that her? Yes, Mincio smiled. Her name is Yuna. Jimin took the photograph carefully. His fingers trembled as he held it. How is she now? Mincio's smile grew slightly. She sings. J-Hope lowered his eyes and smiled. Jin quietly exhaled. Even Suga's expression softened. She sings, Jimin repeated. All the time, Mincio said. Sometimes too much. Jin finally spoke. That sounds familiar. The The tension broke for one brief second as a few people smiled, but it did not last. Minseo's face became serious again. "She's outside." Jimin looked up. "Yuna," Minseo nodded. "She didn't want to come in." Suga immediately understood why. "She doesn't know we're talking about her." "She knows." Minseo looked toward the darkened entrance to the studio. "But she thinks she doesn't deserve to meet you." Jimin's expression changed. "Why would she think that?" Minseo looked at the notebook. "Because she read your words too." The room became still once again. Jimin looked at the old pages in Minseo's hands, and for the first time he seemed afraid of them. Not because they contained secrets, but because his private pain had somehow traveled through another person's life and reached a child he had never met. Jungkook stepped forward. "What did she read?" Minseo shook her head. "Only the page I had read. I never let her read anything else." Suga watched Jimin carefully. "And what did she say?" Minseo's lips trembled. "She said she understood." Jimin's eyes filled with emotion. "Understood what?" Minseo took a long breath. "What it felt like to think everyone needed you to smile even when you didn't know how." The words settled heavily between them. Jimin looked toward the studio entrance. Beyond the bright stage, behind the walls and security doors, a 15-year-old girl was waiting. A girl whose life had crossed his on a night he barely remembered. A girl who had survived a childhood illness. A girl who had grown up hearing that someone helped her mother when he himself had believed he was too lost to help anyone. Suga looked at Jimin, and in that moment, the anger that had exploded on live television seemed to transform into something quieter, something more difficult. He understood that Jungkook's confession was only the first thread. The real wound had never been about one person abandoning another. It was about all of them believing that love meant protecting people from the truth. Jimin protected the others by hiding his pain. Jungkook protected Jimin by keeping a promise. Suga protected Jimin by watching from a distance and convincing himself he would know when to step in. And Minseo protected a notebook because she thought returning it without an explanation would hurt the man who had unknowingly changed her family's life. Every one of them had acted from a place of care. Every one of them had also allowed silence to grow. Suga walked toward Jimin and crouched slightly beside his chair. "Do you want to see her?" he asked. Jimin stared at the photograph. "I don't know." "Then don't decide because everyone is watching." Jimin looked at him. "They're not watching anymore." Suga glanced around the studio. Staff members had moved away. The cameras were down. The audience had been quietly dismissed. Only the members, Minseo, the host, and a small group of essential staff remained. "Exactly," Suga said. "So decide for yourself." Jimin looked toward the entrance again. His eyes were full of uncertainty. Jungkook stepped closer but stopped several feet away. "If you don't want to see her, I'll understand." Jimin looked at him. "This isn't about you." Jungkook nodded. "I know." For the first time, there was no defensiveness between them, only acceptance. Jimin slowly stood. He handed the photograph back to Minseo and took a deep breath. "Where is she?" Minseo looked toward the entrance. Before she could answer, a faint sound came from beyond the closed studio doors. Someone was singing. It was quiet, barely more than a whisper. A young voice, trembling slightly, singing the melody of an old song Jimin had once practiced alone on the night everything began. Jimin froze. Suga looked toward the door. Jungkook's eyes widened. Minseo covered her mouth. Jimin took one step toward the sound, then another. And as his hand finally reached for the door handle, Suga quietly followed behind him, not to protect him from what was waiting on the other side, but because for the first time that night, he understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone you love is not to speak for them, not to defend them, and not to demand the truth. Sometimes, you simply stay close enough that they know they do not have to face it alone. Jimin's hand remained on the studio door for a moment longer than anyone expected. On the other side, the young voice continued singing softly, repeating only a few uncertain lines before stopping, as if the singer had suddenly remembered that someone might be listening. The corridor outside was dim compared with the stage. A row of ceiling lights reflected across the polished floor, and beyond the security doors, the building had begun to empty. It was late now. The kind of late hour when television studios lost their glamour and became what they really were: long hallways, coiled cables, half-empty water bottles, tired staff members, and rooms that held traces of conversations nobody would ever see on camera. Jimin slowly opened the door. Suga was directly behind him. Jungkook stood several steps farther back, with RM, Jin, J-Hope, and Taehyung quietly following. Minseo remained close to the doorway, but she did not call her daughter's name. She allowed Jimin to see her first. Yuna was sitting alone on a bench near the far wall. She wore a pale blue jacket that looked slightly too large for her, and her backpack rested on the floor between her shoes. In her hands was a small, worn music player with one earbud cord wrapped around her fingers. She had been staring down at the screen, but when the door opened, she immediately stopped singing. Her eyes moved toward her mother. Then she saw Jimin. Everything about her body seemed to freeze. She looked exactly like a 15-year-old who had suddenly realized that a person from stories had become real. Jimin stopped walking. The others stopped behind him. Nobody spoke. Yuna slowly stood up from the bench. Her eyes were wide, but she did not smile. Jimin noticed that first. Most people would have expected excitement, a photograph, a scream, tears of happiness. Instead, Yuna looked frightened. Not of him exactly, but of what the moment meant. Jimin understood that feeling better than anyone. He did not move closer. "Hi," he said softly. Yuna's lips parted, but no sound came out. Mincio took a step toward her. "Yuna!" The girl immediately shook her head. "Mom, it's okay." Her voice was quiet. She looked at Jimin again. "I didn't know they would stop the show." Jimin glanced briefly toward the studio. "Neither did we." A tiny, nervous laugh escaped Yuna before disappearing again. Jimin noticed the music player in her hand. "Were you singing?" Yuna looked embarrassed. "A little. I heard you." Her face turned red. "I'm sorry." Jimin frowned. "Why are you apologizing?" "Because I shouldn't have been singing outside." "Why not?" Yuna did not answer. She looked down at the floor. It was then that Jimin noticed something nobody else had seen. Her fingers were trembling around the earbud cord, not from meeting him, not from being nervous in front of the BTS members standing behind him. It was a familiar movement. Her thumb rubbed repeatedly against the plastic wire, then stopped, then began again. Jimin had seen that gesture before. He had done it himself countless times without realizing it. It was the movement of someone trying to stay present when their thoughts had already gone somewhere else. He glanced at the backpack by her feet. A small notebook was sticking out from an unzipped pocket. Jimin's expression changed. "Do you write?" Yuna immediately pulled the backpack closer to herself. "Sometimes. Songs." She nodded. "And other things." Jimin smiled faintly. "Me too." Behind him, Suga watched the exchange without interrupting. The anger that had consumed him earlier was gone, but his attention had become sharper. He could see what Jimin was doing. He was not trying to make Yuna comfortable by acting like a celebrity. He was looking for the smallest doorway into a conversation she could survive. Jimin took a seat on the bench across from her rather than beside her. He left space between them. "Your mother told me you read one page from my notebook." Yuna's eyes filled with immediate fear. "I didn't mean to." Mincio stepped forward. "Yuna, I told you you don't need to." Jimin gently lifted his hand, not to stop Mincio harshly, but to ask for a moment. "It's okay," he said. Yuna looked at him. "Are you angry?" "No, even though it was private." Jimin was silent for a moment. "It was private." Yuna lowered her head. "I'm sorry." Jimin leaned his elbows against his knees. "Can I tell you something?" She nodded. "When I wrote that, I didn't think anyone would ever read it. I didn't think anyone would understand it either." Yuna looked at him carefully. "I did." Jimin's eyes softened. "Your mother said that." "I didn't understand everything," Yuna continued. "But I understood the part about being tired of people needing you to be okay." The hallway became silent. Jimin did not look away. "Who needs you to be okay?" he asked. Yuna immediately shrugged. "Nobody." Suga's eyes lowered. Jimin remained calm. "You don't have to answer." Yuna nodded, but her fingers began twisting the earbud cord again. Jimin noticed. "Do you know why I asked if you write?" Yuna shook her head. "Because sometimes it's easier to put the truth somewhere before you're ready to say it." Yuna looked at the notebook in her bag. Her mother had not known about it. Neither had anyone else. Mincio's face changed slightly, realizing there was something her daughter had never shared. Yuna noticed her mother's expression and immediately became defensive. "It's nothing." "Okay," Jimin said. "It can be nothing." The girl looked at him, confused. Jimin continued. "Not everything has to become important just because someone notices it." Suga finally looked away for a second. The words reached him too. Earlier that night, everyone had tried to make Jimin's silence mean something they could solve. Jungkook wanted to confess. Suga wanted answers. Mincio wanted to return what she had carried for years. But Jimin was now offering Yuna something none of them had offered him when he was struggling. The right to decide when a private feeling was ready to become a conversation. Yuna's eyes filled with tears. "Then why did you tell me to write?" Jimin smiled sadly. "I didn't tell you to write." She looked at him. "You said you do it when it's hard to talk." "Yes, so it helps." Jimin thought about it. "Sometimes. And when it doesn't." Jimin's smile disappeared. He looked toward Suga. It lasted only a second, but Suga understood the question. Then you need someone, Jimin said. Yuna followed his eyes toward Suga. Suga remained standing against the wall with his arms loosely folded. Jimin looked back at her. Writing can hold your thoughts, but it can't always hold you. Yuna became very still. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then she reached down and pulled the notebook from her backpack. Her hands were shaking badly now. Minseo moved instinctively toward her, but Suga quietly raised his hand, asking her to wait. Yuna looked at Jimin. I wrote something about tonight. Jimin nodded. You don't have to show me. I want to. The notebook was small and covered in faded stickers. Yuna opened it but did not hand it to him immediately. I wrote that I didn't want to meet you. Jimin nodded. I guessed. I thought if I met you I would have to tell you thank you. Jimin's face softened. You don't. But I do. Her voice cracked. Because if you hadn't helped my mom. She stopped. Minseo covered her mouth. Yuna looked at the floor. I know you didn't save me. I know that's not fair to say. Jimin's eyes immediately filled with emotion. The girl continued. Doctors helped me. My mom helped me. Lots of people did. But my mom said that night, before all of that, she didn't know what to do anymore. Jimin remained silent. She said you saw her when nobody else did. The words struck him harder than any praise could have, because Jimin remembered what it felt like to be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. He had never thought that simply noticing Minseo's fear had mattered so much. He had believed he had done something small because, at the time, he had needed to do something outside himself. Yet that brief act had become part of another family's history. Jimin slowly looked at Minseo. I almost didn't come out of that practice room. Minseo began crying. Jimin continued, his voice quiet. I remember sitting there and thinking I didn't have anything useful to give anyone that night. He looked back at Yuna. Then I heard your mother crying. Suga's expression changed. Jimin had never told him this. Jungkook looked equally surprised. I thought maybe if I could help one person get home, I could get through the rest of the night too. Jimin gave a faint, painful smile. That's the truth. The corridor seemed to grow quieter around them. You helped her, Yuna whispered. Jimin shook his head gently. We helped each other, she just didn't know it. That was the moment Suga finally understood the emotional weight Jimin had been carrying for years. It was not only that Jimin had hidden his pain. It was that he had believed pain made him less useful, less worthy, less capable of giving anything to the people around him. But the night he had felt most empty, he had still noticed another person's fear. His kindness had not disappeared simply because he was struggling. Suga slowly walked away from the wall and approached them. He stopped beside Jimin, but he did not speak immediately. Jimin looked up at him. What? Suga glanced at Yuna's notebook. You saw something. Jimin's expression changed. Suga looked at Yuna. Earlier you were twisting that wire. Yuna immediately released the earbud cord. Sorry. Don't apologize, Suga said. His voice was gentler than before. He does the same thing. Jimin looked at him. I do not. Suga raised an eyebrow. You literally did it with your microphone 10 minutes ago. For the first time that night, Jimin laughed. A real laugh, brief but unmistakable. Even Yuna smiled. The tension loosened. Suga looked at the girl again. You don't have to explain your notebook to anyone, but if you're writing because you're carrying something alone, don't let the notebook become the only thing that knows. Yuna looked at him quietly. The words were simple, but they carried the memory of everything that had happened on the stage. Jungkook lowered his head. He understood them too. Suga turned toward him. And you? Jungkook looked up. The others watched carefully. I was angry because I thought you walked away from him. Jungkook nodded. I did, but I was also angry because I recognized myself. Jungkook's eyes widened slightly. Suga looked at Jimin. I knew enough to worry. I didn't know how to make him talk, so I told myself giving him space was respect. Jimin listened without interrupting. Maybe sometimes it was, Suga continued. Maybe sometimes it wasn't. He looked back at Jungkook. But we're not going to stand here and compete over who failed him more. Jungkook swallowed hard. Suga's voice became firmer. If we're going to regret something, regret it properly, learn from it. The corridor remained silent. Jimin looked at both of them. His eyes were wet now, but he was not crying. I didn't need either of you to save me. Suga nodded. I know. I needed you to believe me when I said I wasn't okay. Jungkook closed his eyes. Suga's face tightened. Sentence was simple, but it was the truth they had avoided. Jimin had learned how to hide because people often accepted his smile as proof that there was nothing beneath it. Jungkook had seen the tears but accepted the request for silence. Suga had seen the changes but accepted the word fine. Both had mistaken Jimin's ability to continue for evidence that he did not need anyone. J-Hope quietly stepped forward. We all do that sometimes. Everyone looked at him. His voice was warm but serious. We look at someone functioning and think they're okay. RM nodded slowly. Because stopping to ask again can feel intrusive. Or frightening, Taehyung added. Jin folded his arms. Or because we're afraid they'll actually answer honestly and we won't know what to do. Nobody laughed at his words. They were too true. The group stood together in the narrow hallway, stripped of the polished image that had existed on the stage only minutes earlier. No cameras were broadcasting now. No audience was waiting for the perfect quote. There were only people who had known one another for years realizing that familiarity did not automatically mean understanding. Jimin looked at Yoona again. Can I see what you wrote? Yoona hesitated. You said I don't have to. You don't. Jimin smiled. I'm asking. She looked down at the notebook, then held it toward him. He accepted it carefully. The page contained only a few sentences. Jimin read them silently. His eyes moved slowly from one line to the next. Then he stopped. Suga watched his face. What is it? Jimin looked at Yoona. Are you sure you want them to hear? Yoona nodded. Jimin looked at the others, then read the sentence aloud. I thought famous people were different because everyone could see them. Tonight I learned that being seen isn't the same as being understood. Nobody spoke. The words hung in the corridor. Minseo began crying again. Jungkook looked toward the floor. RM slowly nodded as if the sentence had explained something none of them had been able to put into words. Jimin closed the notebook. That's a good line. Yoona looked embarrassed. Really? Really? Suga looked at Jimin. Something had shifted. He could see it clearly now. Jimin had not become magically healed because an old notebook had returned. Jungkook's guilt had not disappeared because he apologized. Their mistakes could not be erased, but the direction of the night had changed. They were no longer searching for a villain. They were learning what had been missing. Someone needed to ask. Someone needed to answer. Someone needed to stay after the first answer was, I'm fine. Suga looked toward the closed studio doors. We need to go back inside. Jimin frowned. Why? Because we ended a live broadcast in the middle of a confession. Jin nodded. The internet is probably having a peaceful and completely reasonable reaction right now. That finally earned another small laugh, but Suga was serious. There are millions of people making up their own version of what happened. Jimin's smile faded. Jungkook looked at him. You don't owe them anything. No, Suga agreed, but we owe ourselves a better ending than leaving everyone with anger. Jimin stared at the studio doors. The decision settled over him. He had spent years believing that the safest thing was silence. Yet tonight, silence had become a different kind of danger, not because every secret needed to be revealed, but because silence had allowed everyone around him to create their own explanations. He looked at Minseo. Would you be okay going home if we go back on? She nodded quickly. Yes. Then he looked at Yoona. Do you want to stay? Yoona immediately shook her head. No, Jimin smiled. Good, then don't. Yoona smiled back. He handed her notebook to her. Keep writing. She held it to her chest. What about your notebook? Jimin looked at Minseo. She slowly extended the old black notebook toward him. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he pushed it gently back toward her. Keep it tonight. Minseo looked shocked. Jimin, I came to return it. You did, but it belongs to you. Jimin nodded. I know. He looked at Yoona. Tomorrow, send it to me. Minseo frowned slightly. Why tomorrow? Jimin smiled. Because I don't want the last thing this night gives you to be another thing you have to let go of. Minseo covered her mouth and began crying openly. Yoona stepped forward and hugged her mother. Jimin looked away, giving them privacy. Suga watched him with a quiet expression. You noticed her hands, he said. Jimin nodded. She was scared. Everyone else was looking at the notebook. Jimin looked at him. You noticed I wasn't drinking my water. Suga almost smiled. That was different. Was it? Suga did not answer. Jimin's expression softened. In that small exchange, they understood something without needing to explain it. Jimin had noticed the one detail everyone else overlooked, because he knew what it felt like when small signs went unseen. Suga had quietly understood the emotional weight of that moment, because he finally recognized his own mistake in the way he had once cared from a distance. Together, without planning it, they reached the same decision. They would not return to the stage to explain every private detail. They would return to correct the one thing that had gone wrong in front of millions of people. Anger had taken control of the story. Compassion needed to have the final word. Suga looked at the others. Let's go. Jimin stood beside him. Jungkook took a breath and followed. RM walked behind them, already speaking quietly with the producer about what could and could not be said. J-Hope remained beside Mincio for a moment, making sure she and Yuna had transportation home. Jin spoke to security and asked them to clear the side exit so the two could leave without being surrounded by staff. Taehyung took off his jacket and placed it gently around Yuna's shoulders when he noticed she was cold. Nobody made a speech about it. Nobody turned the moment into a performance. They simply did what they could. Then Jimin and Suga reached the studio doors together. Before opening them, Jimin stopped. Yoongi, Suga looked at him. Are you still angry? Suga thought about it. Yes, Jimin blinked. At Jungkook, Suga looked toward the door. At all of us. Jimin waited. Suga's expression softened. But not enough to let anger decide what happens next. Jimin looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Together, they pushed open the doors and stepped back into the bright studio, unaware that the decision they were about to make would change not only the ending of that night's broadcast, but the way every person involved would remember the moment they finally stopped trying to protect one another with silence. The studio was almost unrecognizable when they returned. Without the audience, the rows of seats looked strangely empty beneath the dimmed lights. Half of the production equipment had been moved aside, and the enormous screens behind the stage were dark. The room that had felt enormous during the live broadcast now seemed too quiet, too exposed. A producer stood near the control desk waiting for instructions, while the host remained seated at the edge of the stage, still holding the cards that had been prepared for a program that no longer existed in the form anyone had planned. Jimin walked past the main couch and stopped near the center of the floor. Suga followed him. Jungkook remained several steps behind. The others quietly spread out, instinctively giving them space. RM spoke briefly to the producer, and after a moment the producer nodded and signaled for the remaining staff to leave the immediate area. One by one, people stepped away. The sound engineers moved toward the far side of the room. Security closed the side doors. Even the host stood up and quietly whispered, "Take your time," before leaving the stage. Soon, there were no cameras pointed directly at them, no microphones held beneath their faces, no audience waiting for an answer. Just 7 men standing beneath the soft overhead lights, surrounded by the silence left behind after too many words had finally been spoken. Jimin looked toward the empty seats. "It's strange," he said. "What is?" Jungkook asked. Jimin turned slightly. "I thought I was afraid of everyone hearing the truth." His eyes moved around the room. "But I think I was more afraid of hearing what all of you would say after." Jungkook lowered his head. Suga walked toward a chair and sat down slowly. He looked tired now. Not physically tired. The anger from earlier had drained away and left behind something heavier. "Then listen," he said. Jimin looked at him. "I'm listening." Suga rubbed a hand over his face. For several seconds, he said nothing. It was clear that speaking did not come easily to him. Everyone knew that. Suga could turn complicated emotions into lyrics, arrange them inside melodies, hide them inside metaphors, and place them in a song for millions of strangers to hear. But when the person sitting in front of him was someone he cared about, the words could become much more difficult. "That night," Suga finally said, "when Jungkook came to the studio." Jungkook looked up. "I remember," Suga nodded. "You asked me what I would do if someone looked like they needed help but told me to leave them alone." Jungkook's expression tightened. "I was hoping you would tell me what to do." "I know, but you told me not to force them." Suga nodded slowly. Jimin looked between them. "You told him that?" Suga's eyes remained on Jungkook. "I said that if someone asks for space, you give them space. I said you can wait nearby. I said you can make sure they know you're there." His voice became quieter. "What I didn't say was that sometimes people ask for space because they don't know how to ask for anything else." Jungkook's eyes filled with regret. Suga continued. "I was giving you the advice I wanted to believe was always right." He looked at Jimin. "Maybe because I was doing the same thing with you." Jimin remained still. "You were watching me." "Yes, and waiting for me to ask." "Yes." Jimin gave a faint nod. "I understand." Suga looked directly at him. "No, don't make it easy for me." The words surprised everyone. Jimin frowned slightly. Suga leaned forward. "You don't have to understand it just because I had good intentions." Jimin's eyes softened. Suga continued before he could answer. "I should have asked again." The room remained silent. "And if you still said you were fine, I should have found another way to be there without making you feel trapped." Jimin looked toward the floor. "I probably would have been angry. I know. I might have told you to leave. I know. I might have hated you for asking. I know." Suga's voice did not change. "I should have asked anyway." Jimin's lips parted, but no words came out. For years, he had been surrounded by people who cared about him. He knew that. He had never doubted it. Yet caring for someone and reaching them were not always the same thing. Sometimes the people closest to you stood outside a locked door, respecting your privacy, unaware that you had forgotten where you put the key. Jimin sat down on the floor in front of Suga's chair. The movement was so ordinary that it made the room feel less like a confrontation and more like an old practice room after everyone else had gone home. Suga looked down at him. "What?" Jimin asked. "You'll ruin your clothes." Jimin smiled faintly. "That's your concern? Someone has to have priorities." Jin, standing near the edge of the stage, let out a quiet laugh. The tension softened for a moment. Jimin leaned back against the front of Suga's chair. It was a small gesture, but it changed everything. He was not asking to be rescued. He was choosing to stay close. Suga's hand rested briefly against Jimin's shoulder. Neither of them looked at the other. They didn't need to. Jungkook watched them and then slowly stepped closer. "I say something." Jimin looked over his shoulder. "You're going to say it anyway." A faint, painful smile appeared on Jungkook's face. "Probably." He sat down a short distance away, leaving enough space that Jimin would not feel cornered. "That night, I didn't walk away because I didn't care." Jimin's expression changed. "I know." Jungkook looked surprised. "You do." "I didn't say I wasn't hurt." Jimin's answer came gently. "But I know you cared." Jungkook lowered his head. "Then why did I leave?" Jimin did not answer immediately. "Because you were scared." Jungkook looked up. Jimin continued. "You were younger. You thought saying the wrong thing would make everything worse." "Yes, and then I told you to go." "You did. So you listened." Jungkook's eyes filled with tears. "But I wanted you to stop me." Jimin stared at him. Jungkook laughed quietly through the emotion. "That's the part I've never forgiven myself for. I wanted you to tell me to stay because I was too scared to decide it on my own." Jimin looked down. For the first time, he seemed to understand that Jungkook had carried his own version of that night. "I told you to leave because I was embarrassed," Jimin said. "I know. I didn't want you to see me like that. I know. I thought if you stayed, I would have to explain everything." Jungkook nodded. "And I thought if I stayed, I would have to know what to do." The truth between them was almost painfully simple. Two people had cared about each other and still failed to reach one another because both were waiting for the other to make the first impossible move. Suga looked at Jungkook. "That's what made me angry." Jungkook nodded. "I know." "No, listen." Suga's voice remained calm. "I was angry because I wanted someone to be brave when I wasn't." Jungkook looked at him. "Hayoung, I saw things too." Suga glanced at Jimin. "Maybe not that night, but other nights, other days." Jimin's expression became quiet. Suga continued. "I knew you were getting good at pretending." Jimin looked away. "I didn't know that was a compliment." "It wasn't." "I know." Suga leaned back. "You became so good at making everyone comfortable that nobody realized how uncomfortable you were." Jimin's fingers tightened around the edge of his sleeve. "That's not anyone else's fault." "Maybe not." Suga's eyes were steady. "But it doesn't mean we should pretend we couldn't have done better." RM finally stepped closer. Until then, he had allowed the conversation to belong to the three of them. Now he sat on the edge of the stage. "There is something I want to say, too." Jimin looked at him. RM smiled faintly. "Not to turn this into a group therapy session." Jin immediately muttered, "Too late." A few quiet laughs moved through the room. RM continued. "We built our lives around working together. We learned each other's habits, moods, strengths, weaknesses, but sometimes familiarity makes you lazy." The others listened. "You think you know what someone's silence means because you've known them for so long." He looked at Jimin. "And sometimes you stop asking because you think you already know the answer." Jimin nodded slowly. Taehyung, who had remained quiet for most of the night, spoke next. "Sometimes you also don't want to ask because you know the answer might change the whole room." Everyone looked at him. Taehyung's eyes were thoughtful. "If someone says they're not okay, then everything changes. You can't just go back to the way things were." J-Hope nodded. "But maybe that's the point." The conversation settled into a deeper silence. Nobody was trying to solve the past anymore. They were simply sitting with it. That was new. Jimin looked at the empty stage, remembering the red camera light, the sudden anger in Suga's voice, Jungkook's confession, and the old notebook returning from a night he had nearly forgotten. "I hated that notebook," he admitted suddenly. Minseo had taken it with her, but the memory of it still seemed present in the room. Suga looked down at him. "Why?" Jimin gave a quiet laugh. "Because I wrote things in it that sounded dramatic even to me." "That's what notebooks are for," Jin said. "Writing things you don't want people to hear." Jimin shook his head. "I wasn't writing to be heard." Suga's expression softened. "I know. I was writing because I thought if I put everything there, I wouldn't have to say it out loud. Jungkook looked at him. Did it work? Jimin thought about the question. For a while, he looked at his hands. Then I started thinking the notebook was enough. Suga's hand moved again, resting briefly on Jimin's shoulder. It wasn't. Jimin nodded. No. Looked at all of them. None of you were supposed to fix me. I don't think I ever needed that. His voice became quieter. I just didn't know how to let people stand beside me while I was falling apart. Jungkook's face crumpled. Jimin immediately added, and that isn't something I blame you for. But you should have been able to, Jungkook said. Maybe. Jimin looked at him, but I couldn't. Jungkook wiped his eyes quickly and looked away. Suga watched Jimin carefully. Can I ask you something? You already asked a lot tonight. I'll risk one more. Jimin smiled faintly. Go ahead. Suga hesitated. When you grabbed my wrist earlier, what were you stopping me from doing? The room became quiet. Jimin looked at him for a long time. I wasn't stopping you from reaching Jungkook. Suga frowned. Then what? Jimin's smile disappeared. I was afraid you would say something you couldn't take back because you were trying to defend me. Suga's face became still. Jimin continued. I know how you are. Fortunately, you get angry when you think someone you care about was treated unfairly. Suga looked down. Yes, and sometimes you become so focused on protecting them that you forget to ask what they want. Suga slowly nodded. The truth hurt, but he did not argue. Jimin looked toward Jungkook. I didn't want a night to become a story about someone hurting me and someone else saving me. Jungkook's eyes remained fixed on him. Jimin turned back to Suga. Because that's not what happened. Suga exhaled slowly. Then what happened? Jimin looked toward the empty studio doors. Somewhere beyond them, Mincio and Yuna were preparing to leave. A lot of people were scared, he said, and we all made choices because we didn't know what else to do. Suga remained silent. I was scared of being seen when I wasn't okay. Jungkook was scared of saying the wrong thing. You were scared of forcing me to talk. Mincio was scared she had taken something from me. Her daughter was scared that meeting me would mean she had to become grateful in front of a stranger. A faint smile appeared on his face. Everyone was scared. The words changed the shape of the night. Suga looked at Jungkook, then at Jimin. His anger finally seemed to disappear completely. What remained was regret, but regret no longer sharpened into blame. It became something quieter, something useful. I'm sorry, Suga said. Jimin looked at him. I know. Don't say you know. Jimin blinked. Suga's mouth lifted slightly. You don't get to make it easy for me either. Jimin laughed, and this time the laughter lasted longer. The others joined him. It was not loud. It was not enough to erase what had happened, but it was real. And after a night spent beneath cameras and expectations, real laughter felt more healing than a perfect speech. Jimin leaned his head back against Suga's chair. Fine, he said. I forgive you for making mistakes while trying to care about me. Suga looked down. That's generous. Don't get used to it. Too late. Jungkook smiled through tears. Jimin looked at him next. And you? Jungkook immediately straightened. What about me? I forgive you too. Jungkook's expression broke completely. Jimin, but don't confess my private life on live television again. Jungkook covered his face with one hand. Jin laughed. Finally, some reasonable rules. Even Suga smiled. The warmth that returned to the room was fragile, but it was enough. Jimin looked around at the 6 people who had shared so much of his life. I think we should go back on. The others became quiet. Suga frowned. Are you sure? Jimin nodded. Yes. You don't have to explain anything. I know. You don't have to make this comfortable for anyone. I know. Suga studied him. Then why? Jimin looked toward the dark cameras. Because millions of people saw anger. They saw you stand up. They saw Jungkook confess something. They saw me scared. He paused. I don't want the last thing they remember to be us tearing each other apart. RM nodded slowly. Jimin continued. We don't have to tell them everything, but maybe we can tell them something true. Jungkook looked at him. What? Jimin smiled faintly. That sometimes people who love each other still misunderstand each other. The room fell silent. Jimin stood up and brushed his hands against his clothes. Suga rose behind him, the others followed. Before they returned to the stage, Suga quietly caught Jimin's arm. Jimin turned. What? Suga looked at him carefully. Next time. Jimin waited. Don't write it all down and hide the notebook. Jimin's expression softened. Next time, don't wait outside the door. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Suga nodded. Deal. Jimin looked toward Jungkook. Jungkook raised his eyebrows. What? Jimin pointed at him. And next time, stay. Jungkook's eyes immediately filled again. He nodded. I'll stay. There was no dramatic promise after that. No one reached for a camera. No one needed to. The words were small enough to be believable and serious enough to matter. A producer appeared quietly at the side of the studio and asked whether they were ready. Jimin looked at Suga. Suga looked at Jungkook. Jungkook looked toward the others. One by one, they nodded. Then the stage lights slowly brightened again. The cameras were lifted back into position. The red lights prepared to return. And just before the live broadcast resumed, Jimin glanced toward the corridor where Yuna had been standing. He could no longer see her, but he could still hear, somewhere in his memory, the fragile sound of her voice singing alone outside the door. It reminded him of another night when he had believed being alone was the safest place to be. This time, as he stepped back toward the light, Suga walked beside him. Jungkook followed close behind. And for the first time in years, Jimin did not feel the need to pretend he could carry everything by himself. When the red light above the main camera came back on, the studio did not erupt into applause. There was no audience left to welcome them, no music rising to tell viewers how they were supposed to feel, and no host returning to a carefully prepared script. The broadcast resumed with an image that was far more unusual than the explosive moment that had interrupted it. 7 chairs stood beneath the bright lights, but none of the members immediately sat down. Jimin stood at the center of the stage, Suga beside him, and Jungkook a few steps away. RM, Jin, J-Hope, and Taehyung remained close behind. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Millions of viewers watching from home saw only the silence. Then Jimin looked directly into the camera. His expression was calm, but not polished. There was a softness around his eyes that made it clear he had been through something in the short time the broadcast had been off the air. "Before we continue," he said quietly, "I want to say something." Somewhere inside the control room, nobody moved. Jungkook lowered his head. Suga folded his arms, watching Jimin without trying to guide him. "A few minutes ago," Jimin continued, "something happened that none of us planned." His eyes briefly moved toward Jungkook and then toward Suga. "I think all of us reacted emotionally, and that's okay. But I don't want anyone watching to think they know the entire story because they saw a few minutes of it." The words were measured, but honest. Jimin was not denying the conflict. He was placing a boundary around it. "There are things that belong to us," he continued. "Things we will talk about privately, and there are things I think are worth sharing." Suga glanced at him. Jimin took a breath. Sometimes someone can be surrounded by people who care about them and still have trouble saying they're not okay. The studio remained silent. That doesn't always mean nobody cared. Sometimes everyone is just waiting for the other person to know what to do. Jungkook looked toward the camera. His eyes were red. "I made a mistake," he said. Jimin turned toward him. Jungkook continued, "I thought keeping silent was protecting someone. Tonight I realized I was also protecting myself from a conversation I was afraid to have." He paused. "I'm sorry." Jimin nodded once. Suga stepped forward before Jungkook could say anything more. His voice was calm, almost unrecognizable compared with the anger viewers had witnessed earlier. "And I was angry." He looked directly into the camera. "But anger isn't always proof that you understand a situation. Sometimes it's proof that you care and don't know what to do with the feeling." His eyes moved toward Jimin. "I thought I was defending him, but I also needed to listen." Jimin's expression softened. The emotional climax of the night was not coming from a dramatic revelation. It was coming from something much harder for people to do in public, admitting that good intentions did not automatically make them right. RM slowly stepped forward. "We've known each other for a long time," he said. "Long enough to think we understand one another without words." A faint smile appeared. Tonight was a reminder that knowing someone's habits isn't the same as knowing what's happening inside them. Jin nodded. "And apparently, live television is not always the best place to discover that." A small, unexpected laugh escaped Jimin. J-Hope smiled at him, grateful for even that brief moment of lightness. But then Jimin's attention drifted toward the far side of the studio. Near the main entrance, one of the doors opened quietly. The producer had not expected anyone to enter. Security turned immediately. Suga noticed the movement and looked toward the door. Then Jimin's expression changed. Mincio stood there. She had returned. Behind her was Yuna. The girl was holding her small notebook against her chest. For a moment, nobody understood why they were back. Mincio looked uncertain, almost apologetic. A security guard stepped toward them, but Jimin immediately lifted his hand. "It's okay." The guard stopped. The cameras remained live. Suga looked at Jimin, silently asking whether he wanted the broadcast cut again. Jimin shook his head. "No." He walked toward Yuna. She stopped several feet away. The The bright studio light seemed even more overwhelming this time. Her shoulders were tense and her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Mincio whispered, "I'm sorry, she asked to come back." Jimin looked at Yuna. "You came back," the girl nodded. "I changed my mind." "About what?" Yuna tightened her grip on the notebook. "About saying thank you." Jimin's expression immediately softened. He glanced at the cameras, then back at her. "You don't have to do that here." Yuna shook her head. "I know. You don't have to do anything because people are watching." "I know." Her voice trembled. "I want to." Jimin studied her for a moment, then walked to the edge of the stage and sat down so he would be at her eye level. He did not pull her toward the center of the room. He did not invite applause. He simply waited. Suga remained a few steps behind, understanding the importance of that choice. Yuna opened her notebook. Her hands shook. The cameras captured the moment, but the studio felt as though nobody was watching. "I wrote something else," she said. Jimin nodded. "Okay. Can I read it?" "Only if you want to." She took a breath and looked down at the page. "I used to think being strong meant not making people worry. My mom worked when she was tired. Jimin smiled when he was tired. I tried not to complain when I was scared. But tonight I learned that maybe being strong can also mean letting someone know when you're scared." The words reached every person on stage differently. Mincio covered her mouth. Jungkook closed his eyes. Suga's jaw tightened as he looked down at the floor. Jimin did not speak immediately. Yuna continued, her voice becoming steadier. "I don't know if I'm good at singing. I don't know if I'm good at writing, but I want to keep trying, and if I have a bad day, I don't want to hide it until it becomes too big." She finally looked at Jimin. "So, thank you for helping my mom that night." Jimin's eyes filled with tears. "Yuna," she hesitated, "and thank you for saying you weren't okay." The studio became completely silent. It was the one thing nobody expected her to say. Jimin looked at her in surprise. Yuna gave a small, nervous smile. "My mom said you didn't want anyone to know." Jimin nodded slowly. "I didn't. But if you had never written it down, I would never have known someone like you could feel like that too." Jimin could not answer. The girl continued, "I know you didn't write it for me. I know it was private." She held her notebook against her chest. "But sometimes when I read it, I felt less strange." Tears finally slipped down Jimin's face. He looked away briefly, embarrassed by them, but Yuna noticed. "You don't have to hide that either." She whispered. A soft, broken laugh escaped him. Suga turned his face away for a second. Jungkook wiped his eyes. J-Hope placed a hand over his mouth. Even Jin, who usually knew exactly when to bring humor into a difficult moment, remained silent. Jimin looked at Yuna again. "Come here." He did not say it loudly. He did not make a gesture toward the cameras. Yuna stepped forward and Jimin opened his arms. She hesitated for only a second before hugging him. The studio did not erupt. Nobody applauded. The moment was too quiet for that. Jimin held her carefully, one hand resting against the back of her head. His eyes closed. Behind him, Suga watched with an expression that carried the entire journey of the night: anger, fear, regret, and finally understanding. Then Mincio approached. She was crying openly now. "I have something for you," she said. Jimin looked up. The old black notebook was in her hands. She had brought it back. For years, the notebook had traveled from the practice room to a hospital, from a drawer in Mincio's home to a television studio, carrying words Jimin had written when he believed nobody would ever need them. Mincio held it out. "It belongs to you." Jimin looked at the notebook. His fingers did not immediately reach for it. Suga stepped closer. Jungkook did the same. The other members gathered behind them. Jimin finally took the notebook in both hands. He opened the cover. His name was written inside in his own handwriting. He turned the first page. The paper was worn but intact. For a moment, he was back in that practice room years earlier, listening to the same music repeat while he tried to understand why being successful did not automatically make a person feel secure. He remembered writing quickly, almost angrily, as though the pen itself could remove the thoughts from his head. He remembered closing the notebook. He remembered losing it. And now it was here. Jimin stared at the page Mincio had described. He read the words silently. His lips trembled. Then he closed the notebook again. Jungkook watched him carefully. "What are you thinking?" Jimin looked at him. "I'm thinking I was wrong about something." Jungkook frowned. Jimin looked toward the camera. "I thought if anyone ever saw these pages, they would see weakness." He held the notebook against his chest. But Mincio saw something familiar. Yuna saw something that helped her feel less alone. His eyes moved toward the members. "And maybe the people who loved me would have seen me too if I had known how to let them." Suga's eyes immediately filled with emotion. Jimin turned toward him. "You were angry because you thought I was alone." Suga did not deny it. "I was," Jimin nodded, But I wasn't the only one. He looked toward Jungkook. He was alone with his guilt. Then Minseo. She was alone with her fear. Then Yuna. She was alone with her thoughts. Finally, he looked around at the other members. Maybe everyone is carrying something. The statement was simple, but it brought every thread of the night together. Suga stepped beside Jimin. He did not take the notebook from him. He did not speak for him. Instead, he placed one hand gently between Jimin's shoulder blades. "The next time," Suga said quietly, "we ask." Jimin looked at him. Suga continued. "And if the answer is fine," Jimin smiled through tears, "ask again." Jungkook stepped forward. "And stay." Jimin looked at him. "Stay." RM added, "Listen." J-Hope smiled softly. "Wait." Taehyung looked toward Yuna. "Don't assume." Jin folded his arms, fighting emotion. "And occasionally bring food. It solves more problems than people admit." This time, laughter finally broke through the tears. It was not loud, but it was enough. Yuna smiled. Minseo laughed through her tears. Jimin looked at Jin and shook his head. "You waited for that moment, didn't you?" "For several years," Jin answered. The members laughed again. The atmosphere did not become perfect. It became human. And perhaps that was the most important thing about the entire night. The cameras were still broadcasting, but nobody was performing now. Jimin turned back toward Yuna. "You said you sing." Yuna's face immediately changed. "No." Jin raised an eyebrow. "That was fast." Yuna shook her head. "I sing alone." Jimin looked at her notebook. "Like I used to write alone." Yuna looked uncertain. "You don't have to sing," Suga said quietly. "But if you want to, nobody here is going to laugh." Yuna looked at him. The offer remained in the air. No pressure, no dramatic invitation. She looked at her mother. Minseo nodded. Then Yuna looked at Jimin. "The song I was singing earlier." Jimin nodded. "I know. I only know part of it." Jimin smiled. "That's okay." Yuna hesitated. "Would you sing with me?" For a second, Jimin simply stared at her. The question reached somewhere deep inside him. Years earlier, he had sat alone in a practice room, repeating the same melody while believing nobody could understand what was happening inside him. Now, in the same night that his private notebook had returned, a girl whose life had unexpectedly crossed his path was asking him not to perform for millions of people, but to sing with her so she would not have to be alone. Jimin looked toward Suga. Suga understood immediately. "Go ahead," he said. Jimin smiled. "Only if you help." Suga's eyebrows rose. "Absolutely not." Jimin laughed. "You were so brave 5 minutes ago. That was talking, this is different." The others laughed. Jimin looked at Yuna. "We'll keep it simple." She nodded. A keyboard technician standing at the far side of the studio quietly approached the instrument. He did not ask for instructions. He simply sat down and waited. Suga looked at him, then at Jimin. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, he walked toward the keyboard. Jimin's smile widened. "You said no." "I'm not singing." "We'll see." Suga sat down. His fingers hovered above the keys. The studio lights softened. No dramatic effects were added. No audience sound was played. Suga pressed the first note slowly. The melody filled the empty room. Jimin sat beside Yuna at the edge of the stage. For a moment, neither of them sang. Then Yuna began quietly. Her voice trembled on the first line. Jimin waited. He did not correct her. He did not take over. He simply joined her on the next phrase. The two voices were completely different, but that did not matter. Yuna was not perfect. Her breathing was uneven. She missed one word and laughed nervously. Jimin laughed with her and continued. Suga's hands remained on the keys, guiding the melody without turning it into a performance. Jungkook sat down on the floor nearby. J-Hope leaned against the stage. RM closed his eyes. Taehyung watched Yuna with a quiet smile. Jin stood beside Minseo, offering her a tissue without saying anything. The song continued. Then, halfway through, Jungkook joined softly. Jimin looked at him. Jungkook shrugged as if to say he couldn't help it. J-Hope followed with a quiet harmony. Taehyung joined next. RM added a low line beneath them. Jin protested for exactly 3 seconds before singing anyway. The studio gradually filled with voices, not perfectly arranged, not rehearsed, not designed for a concert. It was simply 7 friends and a young girl singing in an empty television studio after a night that had nearly torn them apart. Suga looked up from the keyboard. His eyes met Jimin's. Jimin was crying and smiling at the same time. Suga's expression softened. He returned his attention to the keys. The final note lingered in the air. Nobody spoke immediately after the music ended. Yuna looked around at them, stunned. Jimin leaned toward her. "See," Yuna laughed through tears. "I messed up." "So did we," Jimin said. Jungkook raised his hand. "Professionally." That brought another wave of laughter, but the emotional climax had already happened. Not when Suga shouted. Not when Jungkook confessed. Not even when the old notebook returned. It happened in the silence after the music, when nobody rushed to fix the moment. Jimin looked at the camera one final time. His voice was soft. "If you're watching this and you think nobody would understand you, I can't promise that everyone will." The others became still. "But I think tonight taught me that sometimes people understand more than we give them the chance to." He looked at Suga, then Jungkook, then Yuna. "And sometimes we have to ask again. Sometimes we have to stay. Sometimes we have to let someone see that we're not okay." The red camera light continued glowing. Jimin took a breath. Not because being vulnerable makes everything better immediately. His eyes dropped to the notebook in his hands, but because carrying everything alone can make us forget that someone might already be standing nearby. Suga stepped beside him. Jungkook stood on the other side. The members gathered together naturally, without anyone directing them. Yuna remained beside Jimin, holding her own notebook. 2 notebooks. 2 different lives. Both carrying words that had once been easier to write than to say. And as the broadcast finally faded away from the empty studio, one image remained. Suga standing beside Jimin, no longer furious, Jungkook beside them, no longer hiding behind silence, and Yuna looking toward the lights without lowering her eyes. The night had begun with a confession that threatened to break their trust. It ended with something none of them had expected to find, a reason to rebuild it.